Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to get a drink of water and we're going to get going here. And if you were captured in the feeling of the opening treatment, there's really nothing to be said, to be added unto that. Because the best things in life are invisible. Not only are they invisible, they are ineffable. They are intangible. And yet they are. And yet they are. So for about the last month or so, we've been kicking around ideas about two vastly opposed worldviews, which at the beginning of the journey they seem greatly opposed. One is the world of materialists or materialism that says everything is matter and everything comes from matter. Life comes from matter, consciousness comes from matter, everything comes from matter. And of course, we know you have to go back deeper than that, which is, well, where did the matter come from? And eventually, if you go down that line of reasoning, you get to a point, as you will with any line of reasoning that you follow, you get to the point where you say, well, I don't know, that's just it. It just is. So the energy became the matter, and where did the energy come from? And what caused the energy to become the matter? And the point there is that this energy that we're talking about is largely invisible. So even the materialist point of view recognizes to some extent, to a physical extent, that which we see comes from that which we did not see, we could not see. And if they take it back to the point of the Big Bang and ask what was before that, and we would say, well, there's no way of knowing. And so we eventually exhaust logic and reason. We exhaust the visible. We enter that which cannot be known. I just read a line in one of Eastern texts, and it says the unknowable is making itself known through us and as us. How beautiful. The unknowable is making itself known through us and as us. Have you ever considered, who am I? What am I here? Why am I here? Where am I going? I am this point in time and space. I am this appearance, this incident in time and space, where the unknowable is making itself known through me and as me. So if we go to the flip side of the argument, which we put forward as the ascetic view, which is that matter is kind of an enemy. It has to be fought against, it has to be controlled, it has to be dominated, because spirit is the only truth and matter is the illusion, whereas the materialists would say matter is the only truth and spirit is the illusion. But the ascetic view was that matter somehow had to be overcome. The flesh was the enemy, the body was the enemy, mortal life was the enemy, and we had to kind of beat it down. And this led to some very bizarre practices in the name of religion. People abusing their bodies, not eating their bodies, not wearing clothes that irritated the bodies on purpose, things like this. And what we have to remember there is any time that we're struggling against something, we are reinforcing the belief in its reality. Why would you struggle against something that is not real? the example we've used over and over again is the children in the playground who become aware of their shadow, and they become frightened of their shadow because something is following them. And they're terrified. They're terrified of the shadow. But they're only terrified because they believe it's real. They don't quite comprehend yet that it is an illusion in terms of the fact that it has no power of its own. It is simply a shadow. And there are techniques that adults use to help the children get over that fear. And one of them is learning how to control the shadow. I saw this on a video from India, and I thought it was brilliant. The adult took his hand behind the child and brought his hand down over the child's head so the child could see the shadow of the hand. And the adult was saying, now I'm going to get that shadow and I'm going to control it. And when he touched his hand to the top of the child's head, of course, it looked like the hand had control of the shadow. And then he told the child, he says, you don't need me to do that. You can do that by yourself. And he showed the child how to take his own hand and hold it up over his head so he could see the shadow of his hand come down and grab this shadow figure on the ground. And he says, now anytime you feel that thing is going to bother you, you can just grab it, and then you'll have complete control over it. Right? So the first step was they created the illusion for the child that the child was controlling the shadow, and even though the child was afraid of it, he felt better because they had control over it. And that's what I think we try to do. You know, we find something that we're afraid of, and we try to dominate it, to control it, to subdue it or bend it to our will, you know. And I mentioned in the past, I'm sure, that we had a dog one time that was firmly convinced that the little carpet sweep attachment on the front of the vacuum cleaner, it has a little light on it, you know, so you can see what you're doing. And it's got the beaters in there, and it goes through and it agitates the carpet and sucks the dirt out, you know. And we would turn that on, and that headlight would come on, and that dog, it didn't matter where in the house that dog was. It would get up and it would run, and it would stand right in front of the head of the vacuum cleaner, and it would bark at it. You know, I would push the head of the vacuum forward, and the dog would back up, barking at it, and I would pull the head of the vacuum back towards me, and the dog would follow it. It stayed the same distance no matter how I moved that thing. And there was nothing we could do to stop that dog from doing it. It would just bark and bark and bark, you know. It had no idea what the vacuum cleaner was, but it felt a need to try to intimidate it. So think about that. We do that. We in the psychology of being, psychology of our lives, we tend to take that which we're afraid of and make it an enemy and find a way to subdue it and struggle against it, even if it's not really there, even if it's just a shadow, even if it's something that's an illusion, you know, even if it's just something that's a concept of our mind. So the ascetics, in denying matter, gave matter more power than it actually had. And then we came to the third worldview, which was the higher worldview, which was both matter and what we would call spirit, what the ascetics were searching for. They're two parts of the same thing. Two parts of the same thing. Just as ice and steam are two different expressions of that which we call water. The matter and the spirit are two different densities. Some people call it two different vibrational levels. I've heard some people call it, but two different incidents of life expressing itself. And we've stepped then into this third realm, this third way of looking. And what we want to remember as we're there, as we've gone there on an intellectual journey, we've gone there with thoughts and logic and reason, but hopefully we've also come along with feeling, right? With intuition, with imagination. Because where this leads, where we know where this leads, is it moves into that place where logic and reason no longer exist, no longer work. Awareness is there, consciousness is there, but logic and reason as we know it does not exist. And I'll briefly try to explain that. You know, there's inductive logic and there's deductive logic. So inductive logic, what we tend to do is we take something, a result, and we try to figure out what caused it. We try to work our way back to the cause, you know. And then deductive logic it starts from a knowing and then rolls out from that point of view, which is kind of the opposite impression you would get when you watch Sherlock Holmes, because he would always look at something and say deduction, and while he was working clues and working backwards, deduction actually meant the opposite, which was once you know how it's done. It's kind of like the magic trick. Once you know how it's done, everything else follows. So we, excuse me, we tend to use logic and reason to make an inquiry, and to find out how things work, to explore. And yet the divine mind, being omniscience, it doesn't need to do that because it already knows, you see. So while logic and reason and the intellect, they may be tools that are appropriate for us here, at this time and at this place, as we are, that beautiful, beautiful expression, that beautiful incident, this individualized point of life where the unknowable is becoming known as us. So the best things in life are invisible because life itself is invisible. This thing that we call God or the divine or nature or spirit, or by whatever inadequate term we use for it, is in itself invisible. You know, we can't look through a microscope and see it, but we can see its handiwork. You see, we can see the result of what it is doing, but we can't see it itself. Dr. Holmes gives us an example, you know, of looking in the human body. Look in the human body, you know. If you could take the human body and you could look through every cell, every organ, every tissue of the human body, where would you find consciousness? Where would you find the soul? Is it in any one place? Where would you find this thing that we call life? And you would say, well, I can't find it. But yet it's everywhere present in there, you see. It's already there. Holmes gives us another example, which I think is very easy to grasp. He says, imagine that there's this school of fish in the ocean, and one day the fish hear a preacher fish give a sermon, and the preacher fish tells them about this magnificent thing called water, and how they come from the water, and how the water gives them their very life, and everything is water, and the fish get all excited and they decide, we need to discover this water, we need to find it, and they dart about and they swim here and they swim there and they swim up and they swim down and they swim everywhere, and they're looking for water, and yet they're immersed in it. Their bodies are made up of it. It is already there. So what we are looking for already exists, but we can't see it directly. We can see instead what it does. So Joel Goldsmith, in one of his books, which I recommend everybody should have a copy of it and keep it on your bookshelf and pull it down every once in a while and read it, in his book, Invisible Supply. And while we're on the subject there, I love the quote Jeannie gave us from Dolly Parton, you know, count your blessings more than your money, because your blessings are the cause, right? Your money is the effect. And when you look at prosperity, prosperity may not be the right word for all three levels, right? But when you look at this thing that we would call, for example, wealth, let's call it having enough and plenty, as Raymond Charles Barker would put it. When we look at having the material means to provide for our wants and our needs, We tend to think of it in terms of finances, in terms of real estate, and those kind of things. And the three levels of consciousness, if you look at the three levels and how it crosses that, you've got Napoleon Hill with Think and Grow Rich, which is kind of the doctrine and the creed, and I would say, compare that to a fundamentalist point of view. This is the way it works, and this is how you do it. Excuse me. And then you move into Eric Butterworth, into his Spiritual Economics, which talks about why these things work. But then you move into Joel Goldsmith and Spiritual Supply, and maybe later on we'll talk about prosperity another month, and we'll get into those. But Goldsmith's coming at it from a mystical point of view. Napoleon Hill is coming at it from a pragmatic, this is what you need to do if you want to make money point of view. And Goldsmith is coming at it from a mystical point of view. And he says to consider that this, what we call money, what we call the materials, the goods and the services, the things, the food that we eat, the cars that we drive, the things that we need to live our lives, they are the results of supply. They are not supply in themselves. We tend to think of them as supply. But they are not supply in themselves. That there is a principle of supply that has produced these things. And if there were no principle of supply, these things would not be there in the first place. So the example he gives us in this book, as well as several of other books that he has written, is to consider oranges and orange trees. Now we might go to an orange grove when the harvest is ripe and the oranges are all turned to bright orange and they're ready to be picked, and people are picking the oranges and putting them in baskets, and we say, that's supply right there. But when the trees have been picked bare and when they go into their dormancy for the winter time, the principle of supply is still there. It's still doing exactly what it needs. It's already busy producing next year's crop. It knows exactly what to do, and it's doing it. So we, in our materialistic orientation to the world, we would look at the tree and say, well, the tree is bare. There's no supply there, because we have equated the actual crop of oranges to supply. But the truth is that supply is there just as much as it was when the tree was full of oranges. It's just in a different phase. It's just in a different stage of its unfoldment. So Goldsmith tells us, consider this. So you go to the orange tree and you're going around and you're picking oranges, and you find one limb on the tree, and it has an abundance of oranges on it. This one limb has more oranges on it than maybe 2 or 3 other limbs combined. And you think, wow, this limb is good supply. So we cut the limb off the tree and we take the limb home and we nail it to the wall in our house. And we say, now look at this. I have an unlimited supply of oranges right there nailed to the wall of my house, because that limb was a very good limb. And of course, you know what happens, right? The limb dies and there are no oranges. So Goldsmith says, well, the limb is not supply. And you think, well, maybe I can't just take one limb. Maybe I need the whole tree. So we go out and we cut the tree even with the ground, and we carry the entire tree trunk home. And we set the tree trunk on our floor and we nail it to the floor, and we say, well, now I have oranges forever because I have the tree. And of course, that doesn't work either. The tree will die. And Goldsmith asks us to consider that what was really the supply was the tree's connection to supply itself. The tree was a part of supply itself. The tree was connected to all of life through its roots, through the ground, through the soil, through the minerals. And altogether, these things are working or being worked and used by the principle of supply to do exactly what needs to be done to produce an orange crop. So Goldsmith says if we start to recognize then that there is this invisible principle of supply that is producing the effects, that is producing these things that we see, the dollar bills that we have in our bank account, the food that appears on our table, okay? All of the things of life, just as the oranges come from a principle of supply, all of these things appear in our life because the principle of supply is in operation in our life. This is sort of the New Testament saying, don't worry about these things. Don't worry about the material things of life, but seek first the kingdom. Make your contact with the principle of supply. Seek ye first the kingdom, and all of these things will be added unto you. So what Goldsmith is telling us then is that in the ways of the world, using our logic and using our intellect, using our reason, we would sit down and say, well, what do I need to do physically in order to make more oranges appear in my orchard? How do I select the best trees? How do I use the best fertilizer and all those things? And all those things are good. He's not saying don't do any of those things. But we have to recognize that doing those things is not supply. Doing those things is cooperating with the principle of supply, that it already exists. And that we should not only work in the material, but also work in the spiritual to create a greater level of contact or greater awareness of the invisible that is already within us. Right? So we tend to, because of our orientation of life that we start with, which is we are somehow in here in these bodies. In our culture, we actually think we're in our heads. Right? In other cultures, they think we're in our bellies. The bellies are the seat of consciousness. But we believe we are separated from, we are different than, we are apart from all of these other things. And we try to manipulate those things out there, to use them, to control them, to get them to do our bidding, so to speak. And we've been as a race, human race, we've been very successful, perhaps too successful in doing that. And I say too successful because in some cases we have done that at the expense of the environment. We have damaged our long-term ability to use the things that are there that nature has provided in interest of our short terms. But what Goldsmith is telling us to do is to step back a breath, take a breath and step back, and recognize that supply itself is invisible. And if we can learn how to make that contact, we can open ourselves up as a greater channel of that supply. See, when we first start to overcome these ideas of separation, we think somehow we can reach out and we can grab God and all of God's powers, and we can bring God down to our level to create a better human experience for us. That's what we try to do. That's what human beings do. The epitome of the thought is Janis Joplin, God buy me a Mercedes-Benz. We want to be spiritual, but we want to retain all of the pleasurable aspects of our humanity. We want God to remove all of the unpleasantness from our lives. And then we want God to give us more of the things that we find enjoyable in life. And this is a stage that we go through. This is only natural that we go through this. But it is still a stage in which we are kind of separated from this thing called God and trying to learn how to cooperate with at best or manipulate at worst, but to control it to do our bidding. And that's not what we're talking about here. That's not what we're talking about doing. We are talking about learning how to get beyond the logic and the reason, learning how to get beyond the normal ways of looking at things and recognize that because God only reasons deductively, it doesn't have to figure out how to get something. It already has something. It already is something. It creates everything out of its invisible self. And as we can allow our ego, our intellect, our inductive logic, as we can start to allow that to diminish, then we can start to have the experience that we are already one with this principle of supply, this invisible principle of supply. So counting our blessings then is, to me, when we count our blessings, is we acknowledge and we recognize the presence and the activity of God. This is true gratitude. We acknowledge the presence and the activity of God in everything around us, in everyone around us. Saying grace over a meal is recognizing the miracle of this meal. That this very food that we are about to eat is the visible sign of the presence and the activity of God in this world, providing, through the principle of supply, everything that is appropriate. Everything that is appropriate. So we start to move into then this experience of, because it is not an intellectual knowing, it's not just, well, I can sing about it, I can write about it, I can talk about it. It's beyond those things. It's beyond. Neti neti, it is beyond. But it is the actual experience of the unity of life. The actual experience of the unity with all of the goodness of life. And when we're counting our blessings, when we are experiencing our gratitude, that's what we are causing ourselves to be aware of. That's what we are causing ourselves to bring our attention to. If you just stop and look at life around you, how much of the celebration in life, the awards, the plaques, those different things, they celebrate the human contribution. And I'm not saying the human contribution is not worthwhile, but it's not the only thing. If we spent as much time celebrating the divine contribution as we do celebrating the human contribution, we would be much better off. We would be much better off. Now again, this is not saying that we don't continue to do things that other human beings do, but our point of view, our orientation, is that we are not doing them ourselves. So we kind of move from this idea of separation that I am doing it, I have to do it myself because life has been done unto me, I didn't ask to be born and here I am struggling to make a living kind of attitude towards life. I have to figure out how to make the people that have the money give me some of theirs. I have to figure out how to make the people who have the power give me some of theirs. So our first orientation towards life is how do you figure all that out? The game. The Buddhists tell us the game was in progress when we got here, and we're just trying to figure it all out. We're just trying to figure it all out. So our first orientation then is, as we look at it and think, it's up to me. I have to go do this all by myself. Then we start to progress to a point where we say, well, I'm not doing it by myself. See, I'm doing it in partnership. I'm doing it, excuse me, in conjunction with the divine. The divine is my partner in this, and the divine is helping me. And to a certain degree, that's true. That's a stage to go through. Excuse me, I have to get a drink of water. This change in the weather has stirred up a different kind of pollen, and we were outside for a few hours yesterday taking a walk and got our lungs full of it. Excuse me. So to a certain degree, there's this divine partnership, and we think, well, God is cooperating with me, God has helped me, but I'm still the one who's in charge here. I'm still the one calling the shots. And when we move into the mystical level, the thing that Goldsmith is talking about, when we step into that completely invisible level, I think the degree to which we step into that is the degree to which the sense of I that is separated from God, it diminishes. It diminishes. And so the Sufis give us a tale, which is a simple one to remember, but it is so powerful. And it's about the man who died, and he goes to heaven, and he's in heaven's waiting room, and there's this big door there, and he goes over and he knocks on the door, and the voice from the other side says, "Who is it?" And the man says, "It's me," and he states his name. And God says, "Well, I'm sorry, heaven's full, there's no room for you right now." So the man goes and sits there for a little while, and he's thinking, what do you mean, no room in heaven for me? I lived such a good life. I was always a good man. I this, I that, I the other thing. And he goes and he knocks on the door again. And God says, "Who is it?" And the man says, "It's me," and he states his name again. God says, "I'm sorry, heaven's full. There's no room for you right now." And the man goes and sits and he thinks some more, and finally he says, "Ah." So he goes and he knocks on the door, and God said, "Who is it?" And the man says, "It is thee." And God opens the door and says, "There was never room for the two of us." So at some point we start to diminish the importance of the I and recognize that we are, as I said in the beginning, the individualized incident, the agent of the unknowable making itself known as us and through us. And rather than sitting down and thinking, well, what is it that I want to do, there's nothing entirely wrong with that. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying there comes a point where we say, rather than me trying to sit down and figure out what it is that I want to do, what my aim is to figure out how to let invisible love use me, and flow through me, and express as me. See, if we recognize that we are an instrument that is being used, and it is life itself that is using us, then it becomes very easy for us to understand and accept the fact that life, therefore, has provided everything required. As St. Paul said, no soldier goes off to war at his own expense. We're not going off to war, other than if you want to consider, war against our own ego, as some teachings. Some traditions teach that, by the way. Remember what I said, the more you struggle against something, the more valid you make it. But it is a surrender. It is a sweet surrender. So what Goldsmith says, rather than jump out of bed in the morning and start to think, well, this is what's on my to-do list, this is what I am going to do today, I need to get busy doing it. Again, nothing wrong with that. But there's a better way. And a better way is to stop and sit and be still until we make our contact with the divine. And as we do that, then we can start to become aware of the ideas of what to do and when to do it and how to do it, which is always going to be better, always going to be better than what we had planned. And this, sometimes when I say this, people say, well, how does that work in the business world? You have a boss, and the boss wants a presentation by a certain time, and you have deadlines, and all of that's true. But our traditional way of producing that product for the boss and sitting and listening to the divine ideas come to us for that presentation, two totally different approaches. In the olden days, I would just go through all my old slide sets, and if I didn't have what I needed, I would call my buddies or the guy who had the job before me and say, what do you have on this? And they would shoot me over a PowerPoint presentation. We would go through and sort out until we got, the 8 or 10 slides that we wanted, and that was it, The other way what I'm doing was, put up a blank slide. Be still and know, sit and wait. What's important about this? What's important to say about this? What is the real thing that needs to be said right now? And intuitively, get the information. If you've never done it, of course, it sounds crazy. But the best things in life are invisible. So we talked a lot about supply because supply is tangible. In the email last night, I talked about the pumpkins. Our granddaughter just moved to the country. She's got like 5 acres in the country, and she's loving every bit of it. And she has a garden. She sends pictures once a week of her pumpkin as it's maturing, and it's green, and we're waiting for it to turn orange. And as Wendy said at the beginning, the weather is so crazy that things don't know whether they're still growing or whether they're supposed to ripen, So we're all waiting for this pumpkin to turn orange, hopefully by Halloween. And in the course of it, because pumpkins are on our mind, I heard this piece on the radio, and it was talking about the world record pumpkin. The world record pumpkin is over a ton. It's over 2,000 pounds. What taught the pumpkin how to grow to be 2,000 pounds? What is the power that made the pumpkin grow in the first place? And I don't know if you've ever seen the experiments or the videos on YouTube where as something is growing, sometimes they put a band around it, and this produce will continue to grow until it snaps this metal band. How much power is there? How much does the life force within that pumpkin, the invisible life force, want to grow that it will snap this metal band? I saw something a couple of weeks ago that these mosquitoes, the mosquitoes that have been genetically modified to help control disease, they weren't supposed to be able to breed once they were left in the wild. That was the idea. And now what they're finding the genes have survived. That these mosquitoes that were supposed to be incapable of reproducing are now reproducing. I remember years ago when I was working in Canada, there was a commercial up there, and it was the CEO of a company that made a particular crop that they had produced the seed for. And that seed was supposed to be, it wasn't capable of reproducing. You could plant it, it would grow one crop, but whatever seeds came from the plants it produced were supposed to be infertile. And that was their way of making money. That's the way they controlled things. They had a patent on the seed, and they put it in. And of course, people at the time were worried, and they said, well, what if these seeds start to scatter in the wild and they start to get out and crossbreed with wild strains? What kind of damage might they do to other crops? And this CEO was on TV saying, "Oh, this is entirely impossible. It can't happen." And it happened. Of course, it happened. They've been sued for it. But my point is life, the invisible force of life, will find a way. It will prevail. It will continue on. If you look at the marvels of the planet on which we live, at one time the atmosphere didn't have oxygen. It was something else that was predominant. And then oxygen, which was a poison to all of those other life forms, became dominant, and there was a big die-off. And now, the surface of the earth is predominantly populated by things that, need oxygen. But if you go down to the volcanic vents at the deepest part of the ocean, there's an entirely different form of life down there that doesn't need oxygen. It breathes in the sulfur, excuse me, from the volcanic vents. The invisible power of life knows what to do and will prevail. Because we have come into consciousness in this lifetime, in the worldview of separation, it is very hard for us to stop and say, if life knows what to do and how to breathe the hydrogen sulfide instead of oxygen, if life knows how to take something that mankind has modified so as it should not have been able to breed, but yet life itself has figured out a way how to do that. It is hard for us to identify with that life force itself. If we could, and that is kind of a goal along the way, if we can remove our consciousness beyond this idea of separation and recognize that the air that I breathe knows exactly what to do. The lungs that breathe the air knows exactly what to do. When I breathe out, the trees know exactly what to do. And they all do that because they are part of that one life force. That life force permeates every cell, every organ, every tissue. The things that we think are solid and we can see, we now know are not solid. They appear to be solid. But we've got whirling atoms, protons, electrons, neutrons, subatomic particles. For a while, scientists were telling us, well, things act one way at the subatomic level, but when they become bigger things, they stop acting that way. And now they're starting to find examples where they say, well, that may not be true. There's an interesting article I read on the red sparrow, which migrates from northern Africa to England and across Europe. You kind of draw that path across Spain and France and such. And they were trying to figure out how this animal navigates. And now they're thinking that it navigates by detecting quantum entanglement of electrons. So in the past, scientists would tell us, well, quantum physics does not apply at this level of life. And now we're saying, oh, well, maybe it does. Maybe it does. There is more that we don't know about this universe than we do know. There's more invisible out there that we don't know than we do know. And what we want to do, the point of all this, what we want to do in our spiritual practice is we want to deliberately shift our orientation from separation and from the effect to unity and to the cause. The orange tree has oranges on it because it is connected to life. It is connected to the principle of supply. You and I are connected to life. We are connected to the principle of supply. That which knows how to bring through the existence of the orange tree the perfect fruit, knows how to bring through our existence, through our consciousness, the perfect expression of its own supply. We love one another because love already exists. God loves you by means of me. God loves me by means of you. When we hug, it is the divine hugging the divine as us. So we want to bring ourselves away from the idea of separation into the idea of unity. And we want to find ways to align with the invisible principles. We recognize beauty because beauty is already within us. We recognize truth because truth is already within us. We recognize peace because peace is already within us. So let's take some time every day, go into our spiritual practice for no purpose other than to just simply be alone with the divine. Surrender our agendas, surrender our egos, surrender our intellect, and the only part of our will that we want to take with us is the will that has the intention of experiencing the love and the presence of God. Let's do what we can to make that divine contact, to find the best things of life in the invisible, and then let's watch that unfold through us as the seemingly ordinary things that we do in our day happen in very extraordinary ways. You are not just flesh and bones that are here to eat your bread by the sweat of your brow and bury your children in pain and then die. You are an individualized point in consciousness where the unknowable is making itself known through you and as you, as love, as joy, as peace, and as beauty. And it has already provided all of the materials, the goods, and the services necessary to do that. Take time to celebrate. Take time to experience. Take time to count your blessings. Take time to be in the moment and realize these things. And so it is.